Alright, continuing our series on the Gilded Age, now with the West. Why was it important in U.S. history? Who was there, who was moving there, and also what about the original people that lived there? We'll start with why was the West important. In 1895, a historian named Frederick Jackson Turner wrote a paper called the Frontier Thesis. Now, the frontier is the edge of settlement. In the case of the United States, that edge of settlement, you'd have people living on the east side, and wherever they had moved, right there, where civilization or settlement stopped, they would say that's the frontier. Everything west of that would be open, unexplored, uninhabited land, and so that line right there was the frontier. Turner said that frontier was important because it allowed for mobility, the mobility of the American people. He said that was important for two reasons. Number one, it provided a release valve for excess population. We didn't have to worry about becoming overcrowded. Another reason is it was a place for people to start over. If you had failed in society or financially or whatever in the East, you could always move west and reclaim that. He said it was also important because it inspired inventiveness, which some people also call Yankee ingenuity, the idea that we can invent different things, that the presence of a frontier kind of gave us this goal of, well, what are the other frontiers? What are the frontiers of the mind? And he also said it was important because it encouraged the democratic spirit. All these people moving out there, they had to take leadership roles. They had to be in charge at some point. And so that just encouraged that democratic spirit among everyone. Now, there are certain myths that exist about the West that we need to take care of right off the bat. One myth is it was the great equalizer, that everyone who moved west was equal. That is certainly not true. Rich people who moved west were still rich, poor people were still poor, and they let each other know where they were on the social ladder. Also, any minorities that moved out west, when they grew in number and had the potential to have political or economic power, they had it taken away from them. There's also a myth that the West was a land of opportunity, that people headed west to strike it rich and that they were going to make money. And that is true. There were people that headed west to strike it rich, but in order to go west, you had to have some money to start with, and those that went west usually didn't find anything that was going to make them wealthy. Finally, there's all the Hollywood stuff. Everybody had a gun. There were shootouts all over the place. These were actually rare, far between. One of the images of Hollywood is the wagon trains headed west, hundreds of wagons. And that was true, but in any Hollywood movie, those wagons are at some point going to be attacked by Native Americans, and they're going to circle the wagons. That didn't happen either. Okay? Certainly at some point, some wagon train had to have gotten attacked, but it wasn't everyone. Just didn't happen the way it was. In fact, you could live your entire life out in the West and actually never run into a Native American. There just weren't that many of them out there by this point in time. Now, why is it that people moved to the West? Well, obviously they're moving to the West to try to gain financially, try to gain economically. So what are they going to do out there? There's several different things that they can do. We'll talk about some of the big ones here. Mining. They could go out there looking for those raw materials that exist within the ground and try to extract those because, and here's another connection with our Gilded Age, the big businesses need those raw materials. Think the steel industry. It needs iron, it needs lead, it needs coal. And so those things have to be pulled out of the ground, and there is a market for those. Okay? We probably think of, well, I'm going to go west and I'm going to go look for gold. And there is gold out west, but there's also a lot of lead. You're more likely to find lead. And since that is needed back east, well, there's a market for that. People also went west to farm. There's a ton of land, especially in the Midwest. In 1862, Congress had passed a law called the Homestead Act. The Homestead Act gave people access to land. It would provide you with 160 acres. You were to live on it for 5 years. All you had to do was improve it. Well, what does that mean? It means building a house, setting up a farm, doing something that shows I have added value to this. And at the end of 5 years, the land was yours. You had to pay a filing fee, you had to pay an application fee, so it's basically free land. In addition, going to farm looks like a good deal because there are all these things that are increasing farm yields, increasing the amount of crops that you can grow on a farm and be financially successful without having to expand the size of the farm. Another reason people went west was to ranch, to go raise cattle. There were also other livestock that they could raise, but cattle was the biggest one. And after the Civil War, during the Gilded Age, there was an increase in the demand for beef back in the East. With the invention of the refrigerated rail cars, with the expansion of the railroad industry, fresh meat could be shipped further distances. And so, with more access to fresh meat, customers demanded it, they demanded more of it, and so more needed to be shipped. Before the railroads expanded into Texas, Texas was kind of the center of ranching. Cattle drives were organized, and they'd take, hundreds of head of cattle. They'd march them north across Texas, Oklahoma, into Kansas. A couple of them actually went into Nebraska. But whatever, these cattle drives, they would drive the cattle to a railhead, that's a city there on the railroad, and then ship them off to slaughter. We'll talk later about Chicago. Chicago kind of became the center of the meat packing industries. But whatever, they'd be shipped off to Chicago, slaughtered there, and then dispersed around the country. So, cattle was a way to make your money. This is a map that shows some of the big gold and silver deposits and also the rail lines that existed. If you'll look here, these gray lines extending from Texas up into Kansas and then up into Nebraska. These are some of the cattle drives, the cattle trails that went. This one's the Chisholm Trail, probably the most well-known, that went all the way up here to Abilene, Kansas. So what was it like in the West for these people that moved there? Well, for the miners who went out there, if you went out there as an individual, you probably failed. That's just it. Mining, especially if you want to think of panning for gold, it's very difficult, it's very hard. You first of all have to be lucky enough to find some gold, and you're not going to dig through the ground and find these big, huge, fist-sized chunks of gold. You're going to pan through a creek. You're going to collect the silt that's coming out of that creek and slosh through all the mud until finally what you're finding are little bitty flakes, little bitty dust-sized pieces of gold. Then you have to find enough of it in order to actually make a profit. What happens to these individuals that go out there and they're going to try their hand at mining, they fail. Well, corporations come in. Big businesses come in. Here's another connection. These big businesses came in, bought out the individual miners, but then they would turn back and they'd hire those miners back to keep doing the same thing they were doing. Keep looking for gold. I'm going to pay you this time. I'm going to make sure you have food. I'm going to take care of you. Yay. The downside of that is if you ever do find gold, it all belongs to the corporation. Ranching, again, pretty similar. Individuals go out. Individuals typically failed, but corporations came in and bought them out. Then hired those ranchers back as cowhands. One of the examples is down in South Texas, something called the King Ranch. The King family is actually from New York. And they had a lot of money. They decided to get into the cattle ranching business. They went down into South Texas, bought out a huge number of farms, huge piece of territory, and then hired all those people back as ranch hands. So in both cases, the corporations are successful. And in both cases, because they are big businesses, we have already seen in a previous video what the big businesses do. They take advantage of their workers. Long hours, low pay, dangerous conditions. And so, like workers in industry, these miners and these ranchers would form unions. We don't think of the West with the spirit of independence. We don't think of those people joining together to form unions. But they did, and they had strikes, and they had, in some cases, violent strikes, just like we've already talked about with Pullman and Homestead and those others. Now, farming's a little bit different. There were, in the Gilded Age, some corporate farms. Yeah, so there were some corporation-owned farms, but the problem with farming is, for the corporations, there's just not that much money in it. And so most of the farms were actually being run by individuals. Had individuals trying to do this. On the Great Plains, most of these guys are getting their land through the Homestead Act. So let's talk about the Homestead Act and its effectiveness. How was it if you decided you were going to go take advantage of the Homestead Act? Well, the Homestead Act gave you 160 acres. It was thought by the government that 160 acres would be enough for those people in Virginia and Ohio, in the South. It was fine. 100 acres was plenty to grow a crop, have enough to make a very good profit and be successful. The Midwest is different. The Midwest doesn't have enough rain. And so 160 acres in the Midwest isn't enough. You need more. Fortunately, it's the Gilded Age, and so new inventions are being created, and so farmers are finding new farming techniques and new farming machines, irrigation equipment. They're also starting to use chemical fertilizers. And so they were trying to increase their crop yields. The problem with those is those things are expensive. And so a lot of farmers are going to go into debt. And if you got into too much debt and you ended up not being able to pay it off, again, you would fail. One of the sad things about the Homestead Act is the people that went out and got the land, part of the deal was you had to live on it for 5 years. Not everybody is going to live on it for 5 years. Some of them, before 5 years is up, they'll have already gone broke, had to give up, and go somewhere else. Also, the environmental conditions in the Midwest aren't that great for your living conditions. This is a church built with the local building materials. If you can see, we have a couple of windows, so they've gotten some money and gotten the windows from somewhere. We have some boards that have been put on to make a roof. But if you can tell what this is sod. Sod is dirt that has been cut up out of the ground in the shape. It's in the shape of a brick. If you've seen a new home going in, maybe you have seen them as they are finishing up the house, going out in the yard and laying down these rectangular patches of sod. It's the exact same stuff. Now you might look at this and go, well, wow, sod, wouldn't think that would be a building material, wouldn't think it'd be a good building material. It's not. One of the drawbacks to using sod is if it rains, well, it's all going to turn into mud. On the plus side, we're talking about the Midwest here, it's not going to rain that often. So sod is a good building material for you when you first arrive. You can put this thing up. It actually is cool on the inside. And you can hopefully save up enough money to finally, be able to build a real house if you get the chance. So now, who all's going to the West? Who are these people that are headed to the West? They're immigrants headed to the West. We're not just talking about regular old Americans here with who's in the West. Immigrants, people that are coming to the United States, are headed west. We'll start with the Irish. Irish immigrants were recruited by the railroads back east to start building railroads across the West. So Vanderbilt and James J. Hill and those guys travel to Ireland looking for workers. Okay? The Irish are coming because they're trying to improve their life. Those that work on the railroads are hoping that they can earn enough money to maybe buy some of that cheap land from the railroad companies, or maybe they get out somewhere and be able to take advantage of the Homestead Act. On the other side of the country, there are Chinese moving to the West. Chinese immigrants for the same reason. They're coming to help build railroads. Chinese immigrants will be a little bit different. They're not necessarily looking to acquire land. They're looking for money because they want to take that money and go back to China. But still, they're Chinese immigrants out in the West. There's also going to be a group of people called the New Immigrants. They're going to be from Southern and Eastern Europe, and they're coming to the West usually for farming. Okay. Another group that's headed west are going to be African Americans. In our video on the South, we talked about a group of people called the Exodusters. And the Exodusters saw conditions in the South at the end of Reconstruction. They saw what was coming, and they decided to head to the Midwest to take advantage of that Homestead Act. Many also joined the Army, and they would serve out west as what are known as Buffalo Soldiers. There's also Native Americans out west. And so all these immigrants, all these Anglos that are coming to the West, they're going to have to displace Native Americans. Okay. On the Great Plains, I'm talking about the middle of the country here. So the characteristics of these Native Americans, okay, they were nomadic. The Great Plains are not very hospitable. There's not enough water for really settled agriculture, so they were nomadic. They also proved that they were fiercely independent. When the government said, we want to move our people onto your land, the Native Americans fought back. Okay. The Native Americans were also in the way. They were in the way of settlement. That's what that line means. They're in the way. And so the government actively tries to remove them. It was not a case of settlers moved in and crowded them out. It was the government forcing Native Americans to move, to open that land for the new settlers and for business exploitation. So how did the government do this? What was government policies? Well, real quick, let's go all the way back to Jackson and the Indian Removal Act. In Jackson's case, it was simply, let's move Native Americans west of the Mississippi River. Okay? The government adopted a large reservation policy. Means a huge chunk of land. Oklahoma was the original Native American reservation. They only originally had 5 tribes there. Now what the government is doing, time and time again, and this cartoon illustrates it, is they're taking away Native American independence. And they're doing it in the name of railroads, and they're doing it in the name of politics, they're doing it through the courts. Okay? And so the government's policy is let us degrade the Native Americans and let's take away their rights. Let's take away everything. In 1867, the U.S. adopted the small reservation policy. So the large reservation policy isn't working. There's just too much land. And so the government adopted the small reservation policy. That's probably more familiar to us, the idea of the entire tribe on a much smaller piece of land. And by the end of the 1870s, most of the tribes in the West were on the reservations and they were there to stay. The government promised the Native Americans that in exchange for going to the reservation, the tribes were going to be left alone. They wouldn't have to worry about having to move again. They wouldn't have to worry about the government coming in and taking more land again. They would be left to their own devices and left to practice their own customs as they had before. The government would also provide them with food, clothing, and additional supplies, so they wouldn't have to worry about, especially those that were nomadic, having to chase, having to catch their own food, and they wouldn't have to worry about running out of food because the government was going to be there to provide it for them. Now, a lot of the Native Americans didn't want to go on the reservations. They felt that their life was fine. They had plenty of food anyway. And so the government is going to encourage buffalo hunting out in the West. Okay? Because that was one of the main food sources for the Native Americans who lived in the West, hunting the buffalo to near extermination would force these tribes who no longer had access to enough food to accept the government's deal of going to the reservation. Now, the railroad companies also encouraged it. You have to understand, the buffalo existed by the millions out west. And so the trains, as they would go across the track, if a herd of buffalo came through, that train was going to stop, which put railroad schedules behind, which minimized profits. And so both the government and the railroads are encouraging killing the buffalo, and killing the buffalo became incredibly efficient. As this picture shows us, this is a pile of only buffalo skulls. Nothing else. Just buffalo skulls, just in this one pile. The government's official policy toward Native Americans was they wanted them to assimilate. To assimilate means to take on the dominant culture. And so they wanted to force the Native Americans to adopt that Anglo culture. And when they did that, what they did is they made many of the Native American practices illegal, including a lot of their religious practices. And you are welcome to ask, well, what about the whole First Amendment, freedom of religion? It wasn't until the 30s, the 1930s, that the Supreme Court ruled that the first 8 amendments applied to Native Americans. So in the 1800s, it's okay to deny them their religion. Now, the Native Americans are going to fight back. They're not going to take this lying down. And so from the 1860s through the 1870s, we have something called the Plains Wars. Sometimes it's called the Indian Wars, the Plains Indian Wars, whatever. We'll call it the Plains Wars here. And just a couple of events not doing it justice at all. In 1862, there's something called the Dakota Sioux Uprising. The Dakota Sioux get into disputes with local settlers, and so finally the Dakota Sioux have had enough, and they attack. The U.S. Army is sent in. By December of 1862, the Sioux are defeated. In 1864, a specific event, the Sand Creek Massacre, sometimes now being referred to as the Chivington Massacre, happened in Colorado. This is an artist's interpretation of the Sand Creek Massacre. You see here the federal troops riding in, and you see the Indian village, everyone running away. If you look right here, right in the middle of the village, we see an American flag. The chief of this Cheyenne village had a treaty with the government. And in the treaty, they had told him if he flew the American flag, they would know that he was always a friend. In 1864, in this vicinity, some settlers were attacked by Native Americans, and the Army blames this particular village of Cheyenne for no reason other than the fact that they are close. So early in the morning, the U.S. Army rides in, killing 400, mostly women and children, as a lot of the adult men were off hunting. This is a Cheyenne interpretation of the Sand Creek Massacre. And you see what they've done here. We still have the soldiers riding in. We have them riding into the tents. Everyone who is alive, notice that they are vertical and upright. Everyone who is dead is laying down. And you'll even notice that this person's gone in and added some details. Little babies, obviously women with the skirts. Small people, probably representing children. It's not all bad for the Native Americans. In 1866, there's something called Federman's Massacre, where a group of Lakota Sioux are able to lure American troops into an ambush. This was the worst losses that the Army had suffered at the hands of the Native Americans on the Great Plains up till that point. There will be another one later that will be worse. From 1876 to 1877, there's something called the Sioux War. The Sioux Nation, led by younger chiefs, Crazy Horse and Sitting Bull, go off the reservation. They head from the reservation. They've decided they've had it with that, and they go into a place called the Black Hills of the Dakotas, to the Sioux and to other Native American groups. These hills are sacred. Now, because they left the reservation, the Army is going to be sent out to stop them and return them to the reservation. One of the Army officers who goes out there is a guy named George Custer. He will be leading a cavalry group in the Black Hills, and he and his men are going to be killed at the Battle of Little Bighorn. This, for Native Americans, is kind of celebrated as a high water mark for them. This was the worst defeat of any Army group at the hands of the Plains Indians. Custer and over 200 of his men being killed there in that battle. Unfortunately for the Sioux, and unfortunately for all the Native Americans, it doesn't matter what the results of the individual battles are. What matters is at the end, the United States has overwhelming manpower and support, and they're able, by the end of every single war, every single battle, every single fight with every single tribe, they're able to force them onto reservations. Now, in 1890, we have one more event. Sometimes it's called the Battle of Wounded Knee. Nowadays, it's starting to be recognized more as the Massacre of Wounded Knee. We go back to the Sioux again. The Sioux have adopted, by 1890, they've adopted a new religious practice, something called the ghost dance. The ghost dance actually originated further west, out in California, and what it was a huge religious ceremony that was calling for the return of life before the white man came. Okay. What all would that entail? The white man would be gone. The reservations would be gone. Native Americans would be free to be nomadic again. The buffalo would be back, and so they would have everything would be the way it was. There's no ill will in it. There's no belief that this is going to happen through some kind of Indian or Native American revolution. That we're just going to wake up one morning and everything was going to be right. The problem is the people around don't understand what's going on there, and so the government decided to ban the practice of the ghost dance. And so on the Wounded Knee Reservation, the Indian agent sent for, it's interesting, he sent for Sitting Bull. He wanted Sitting Bull to come to him and explain to him what the ghost dance was and tell him to stop doing it. He sent a group called the Indian Police. The Indian Police were Native Americans working for the government as a police force on the reservations. To the rest of the tribe, they are considered to be traitors. When they went to get Sitting Bull, a fight erupted. The Indian police opened fire, and Sitting Bull was killed. It's just ironic. Sitting Bull was killed by other Native Americans. When Sitting Bull was killed, the rest of the Sioux rose up in anger. They didn't have any weapons, because they had to leave them when they entered the reservation, but still, they started a riot, and so the Army had to come in and restore order. By the time the Army was done, over 300 Sioux were killed. Unarmed Sioux, on the reservation, and still, we had to fight them. Now, whatever way you look at this, putting Native Americans on the reservations, that ended their lifestyle. Wherever it was, whoever it was, it ended their lifestyle, and the reservations were horribly corrupt. Okay? They were run by an agency called the Bureau of Indian Affairs. And the Bureau of Indian Affairs itself was corrupt. And the Indian agents, these are the guys who worked for the Bureau of Indian Affairs who were supposed to provide for the Native Americans. They stole money from the government. They would inflate the numbers that they would say, this is what it's going to cost me to take care of the people on my reservation. But they would inflate that number because anything extra they would pocket. They would also turn around and try to provide for Native Americans on the cheap. When winter came and you need thick blankets, they would buy the thin sheets. Well, here are your blankets. Well, these are thin sheets. They're not going to keep anybody warm. Well, too bad. I bought them for you because it saved me money, because anything I can save, I can also pocket. Okay, so these were horribly corrupt. The government, in a book called A Century of Dishonor, published in the 1800s by a woman named Helen Hunt Jackson. The government she exposed for having made all these treaties with all these different tribes and broke them. The government agreed it was going to do certain things, and she cataloged how in every single treaty, in every single instance, the government had not lived up to its end of the bargain. It was always the Native Americans who lived up to what they said they would do, never the government. Finally, there was forced assimilation, the forced adoption of Anglo culture. In 1884, Congress made it illegal for Native Americans to practice their tribal rituals and their tribal religion. They said this was keeping them too wild. This was keeping them too savage. And so they needed to adopt different customs to start to become true Americans. In 1887, Congress passed a law called the Dawes Act, or the Dawes Severalty Act. Okay? Severalty comes from the word sever, to cut apart. What the government did, originally it had given the reservation to the tribe. Well, under the Dawes Act, they will revoke the reservation. They will take the reservation away, and then the government would cut the reservation up into individual plots. Individual plots of land, and give those sections of land to heads of household. It was thought that by making these Native Americans small farmers, that would put them on the path to becoming more civilized. Now, we've already talked about earlier in this presentation about how 160 acres in the Midwest was not enough to take care of you. But they're going to do that anyway, and of course the Native Americans aren't going to have the same access to credit and whatever else they needed to buy farm equipment and irrigation equipment. And so this was just a way to take the land away from the tribe, because again, if you cut the land up and parcel it out, and then you have land over, that was the government's land. They could then turn around and sell it. There are also boarding schools that were established both inside the reservations and outside the reservations by whites with the idea of assimilating the Indian children. These are sometimes called Indian schools. And so they would force them to dress a certain way, force the boys especially to cut their hair. This is a class photo from one of those schools, and you can see how every single one of these Native American children are just so happy to be there. Okay, if you look at the teacher real carefully here in the background, you can tell she's real happy to be there too. She obviously feels this is her life calling. This girl in particular, I'm sure she just absolutely loves her teacher and loves her school. But another thing that they did was something called white adoption. I think you kind of see this a little bit among certain celebrities nowadays. White adoption was where you had white families who would go onto the reservation and then adopt Native American children and take them with them back to the cities. These kids had homes; they weren't orphans, but they took them back to the cities because the idea was they're going to have a better life. The overall idea behind that was if you adopt a native child, bring him into white American city culture, He will then learn all of our customs and our governing systems and our economic systems, and then when he is an adult, he can go back to the tribe and he can become a leader and he can lead them in these new ways, and that will speed up the assimilation process. Ultimately, what ends up happening to these kids is they're taken into white society. Well, you can cut their hair and change their clothes all you want. Everybody else is still going to see them as a Native American. And so they're never going to fit in the cities. Well, then when they become an adult, you send them back to the tribe. Well, you've spent your entire life, basically, there among the white people and being a part of their customs. Then when you come back to the tribe, you're not welcome there either because you've been with them so long, you might as well be white. And so these people didn't become leaders in the tribe. They became people who had no hope, just like a lot of people that lived and continue to live on those reservations. Look at the places in the United States that have the most poverty. They're going to be reservations. And it all goes back to the Gilded Age, when the government flat out didn't care. Hate to end it on that downer of a note, but I'm just going to tell the truth. I'm not going to sugarcoat it. See you in class.